Hey guys, we're ready to start part 2. So, our enduring understandings for part 2 are pretty similar. All living things are composed of 4 basic categories of macromolecules and share the same basic needs for life. You should know what those 4 basic categories are by now. Our essential questions for this portion of the lesson are: what are the role of carbohydrates in organisms? How do we distinguish between monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides? What reactions do monosaccharides and polysaccharides undergo? And how are polysaccharides different in plants or animals? So I know you're probably like, what the crap is a mono what say what? But don't worry, we're going to talk about those words in this lecture. So your objectives, while you're answering the essential questions, you should be able to distinguish between the structures of monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides, meaning yes, you have to know what their shapes are. Explain the functions of each of those molecules. Describe the formation of these molecules through condensation reactions, sometimes called dehydration synthesis reactions. And describe the breakdown of these molecules through a process called hydrolysis. You should also be able to identify the animal and plant polysaccharides that are specific to each and the roles that they play in those organisms. So we're going to start our notes page with essential question number 1. This is Unit 4, Macromolecules, Part 2. Our essential question is, what is the role of carbohydrates in organisms? Well, first, we should probably talk about what carbohydrates are. So carbohydrates are simple sugars and complex starches. So all that extra tissue that you eat when you eat fruit, right? Those are carbohydrates. So you think of carbohydrates probably like cake and chips and sugar and stuff like that. But in reality, carbohydrates are also simple sugars that are produced in nature. So we did plants last unit, and we talked about how angiosperms have flowers, and they're unique because they produce fruit, which is extra tissue that stores nutrition, and it also convinces animals to eat the seeds, eat, everything, and then disperse the seeds somewhere else. So carbohydrates are a compound, right, that's mainly responsible for giving us energy when we eat that fruit that plants evolved for us to eat. So we would spread their seeds. So carbohydrates: bread, cookies. I'm celiac, so I can't actually have like regular flour, but I can have other kinds of stuff. Anyways, carbohydrates, right? One of the 4 categories of organic molecules. Carbohydrates, right? Pasta, complex carbohydrates. Fruit, most fruits are simple carbohydrates, simple sugars. The other groups are proteins. You should know this already, right? Lipids and nucleic acids. But today we're just going to focus on carbohydrates. So, carbohydrates end in OSE. Now, not all carbohydrates end in OSE, but if you see a molecule that ends in OSE, you know it must be a carbohydrate. So, this is a molecule of glucose. You should probably memorize this shape. Glucose is the most common molecule that we're going to talk about in biology. It's the basic unit of sugar that life breaks down to yield energy, right? So glucose, right? It's got C6H12O6. It's got 6 sides. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, this shape, that's that carbohydrate ring that we talked about when we talked about different or why carbon's special and the different shapes that it can form and the different number of bonds. And carbohydrates are also starches, which are complex. So glucose is simple, starches are a little more complex. So glucose is produced by plants for energy storage through the process of photosynthesis. And 2 common kinds of carbohydrates that you'll learn about are amylose. See, carbohydrate, lose. And see all these little rings? These are glucose monomers. Remember, glucose is a monomer. It's a simple building block. You put a big chain of those together and you get amylose. There's also amylopectin, which is like amylose except for that it's got branches. When you start having big complex molecules like that, that's when we start calling carbohydrates a starch. So simple monomers, we call sugars, or disaccharides, we call sugars if it's just one or two rings. When you start getting big, long chains of these rings, that's when we start talking about starch. Oh, here we go. Produced by plants via photosynthesis, broken down during cellular respiration to create ATP, right? And then when you put these together, when you put glucose together, you get a lot of different kinds of starch, but two that you should know: amylose, which is like a straight chain, and amylopectin, which is branched. And these are molecules that are used for energy storage. The energy is stored in the bonds between each of these monomers. Because remember, a chemical bond is energy storage. So the more bonds you have, the more links in the chain that you have, the more energy you have. These are energy storage. This is a molecule called glycogen. This is also a starch, and this is actually produced in animals using glucose from food. So we eat an apple or a cookie, and we get lots of glucose, right? And then our body takes that glucose and it builds these giant molecules of glycogen. And this is energy storage. Remember, lots of branches, lots of monomers, right? There's energy contained in every single one of those little links between the chain, or between the monomers. And we store this molecule in our liver. We also break it down and use it for energy via cellular respiration. Yeah, we already talked about that. So, carbohydrates aren't only used for energy storage, they're also used for structure. Cellulose is a structural carbohydrate that you find in plants. It's actually what composes the cell wall of plants. And it's made out of these very uniform, nice, neat sheets that help give structural integrity to the cell walls. Now, when you eat celery or you eat lettuce, right, it's just a bunch of crunchy stuff with water. That's mostly cellulose. Now, humans can't digest cellulose. We don't have the proper enzymes to break cellulose down, so we pass it through. So that's why they say if you're constipated, eat something with a lot of fiber, a lot of cellulose, because we can't break this down. It helps kind of push everything through and clean you out. But yeah, so this is a structural carbohydrate, ends in OSE, cellulose, in plants. Right? Cell wall. It's made of cellulose. There's also structural carbohydrates in animals. So chitin is a long chain of monomers that builds the exoskeleton for certain bugs and animals like crabs, right? So anything that like crunches and squishes when you step on it that has an exoskeleton, that's made from chitin. The exoskeleton's made from chitin, which is a carbohydrate. So, one more time, carbohydrates are used for energy storage, and they're also used for structural purposes. And you have some examples of polysaccharides, or complex carbohydrates, that are used in both plants and animals for structure and energy storage. Now, remember on the notes last time I told you to put those letters next to your table, CHO, right? So this is what I'm talking about. Carbohydrates always have the same ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen. So glucose, right, C6H12O6, you see that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. For every one carbon, there's 2 hydrogen, and your carbons always equal your oxygens, 1 to 2 to 1. So you can tell what a molecule is, right? Without having to memorize it, you can tell by its shape and you can tell by what letters are in it. And that's probably the easiest way. So I'll teach you the whole cho, chan, chomp thing. Well, this is CHO, CHO. Carbohydrates only have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, CHO. And they always have it in this 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Fructose has the same chemical formula, but it's arranged a little bit differently. See how glucose has 6 sides? Write that down. Glucose has 6 sides. Can I write? There we go. Fructose has 5 sides. Now, the chemical formula is the same, but their shapes are different. And don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to memorize all these. You should know the chemical formulas, and you should understand that the chemical formulas are the same, but that their shapes are different. There is one other one that you should know, ribose. So you will have to be able to tell the difference between ribose and glucose. And that's really easy because ribose has 5 sides. And when we talk about nucleic acids, that'll make much more sense. But for now, just know that there's lots of different carbohydrate monomers, right? But they all have the same ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen. Oh, there's one more, galactose, which also has 6 sides. So we'll do 5 sides, 6 sides, 5 sides, 6 sides, right? They all have the same chemical formula. That's okay, right? They have that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, and they all end in OSE. Remember, these are monomers. These are the building blocks. Monomers. So, if a carbohydrate has 4 carbons, how many hydrogen and oxygen would it contain? Well, if we do the 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, right? We know that carbon and oxygen have to be the same. So this should be 4, right? And we know that hydrogen has to be double whatever the carbon is. So that should be 8, right? If it's really a carbohydrate, let's see. Am I right? I am right, right? So you have that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Remember, monomers are the simple organic building blocks. And when you put them together, that's when you get polymers. So now we'll talk about carbohydrate polymers, the more complex molecules that you get when you put monomers together. So, essential question number 2, how do we distinguish between monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides? Well, remember, monomers are monosaccharides, meaning it's just one ring. So if you need to put that down, put that down. Monosaccharides are one ring. Okay, and here's our glucose molecule. You know it's glucose because it's got that 1 to 1 ratio, or 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, and it's got 6 sides. And these are simple sugars, glucose, fructose, ribose, galactose. We just talked about that. These guys bond together to form more complex sugars. So there's our one monosaccharide. If you put 2 monomers together, so just 2, that would be a disaccharide. If you put more than 2 together, you get a polysaccharide. Okay, so just 2 rings is a disaccharide. More than 2 rings is a polysaccharide. Okay. An example of a disaccharide that you might be familiar with is lactose. Lactose is a carbohydrate that's found in milk, right? So if you know someone that's lactose intolerant, that means they don't have the enzyme that physically breaks this molecule down. You can think of an enzyme as like a pair of scissors that will break molecules apart. They don't have that. So that means that they cannot digest this molecule. If you do have that enzyme, you can break these apart into their 2 monomers, glucose and galactose. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about enzymes. So if you drink lactose-free milk, you drink milk that has had enzymes added to break down lactose into glucose and galactose. Now, when you start adding more complex or more rings, you get more complex molecules, and these are polysaccharides. So the ones that we talked about earlier were amylose, right? And we find that in plants. Amylopectin, and we also find that in plants. And remember, these are energy storage. Right? And we also talked about glycogen. And this is in animals. Animals. And that's also energy storage. Right? And then we also talked about polymers that are used by plants and animals for structure. Right? Do you remember what those are? We talked about chitin, which is in animals, and that's used for structure, specifically exoskeletons. And we talked about cellulose in plants, and they're structural as well. And they make cell walls. Right? So we've talked about a number of polysaccharides already. So really, you can tell the difference between monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides by counting the number of rings. Monosaccharides are 1 ring, disaccharides are 2 rings, and polysaccharides are more than 2, really. So 3 or more. Right? So I know this stuff looks like it's scary and it's got big words, but really it's not. You just got to learn what the words mean and you'll be fine. Okay, we're going to do essential question number 3. What reactions do monosaccharides and polysaccharides undergo? So now we're talking about types of reactions. So in order to build polysaccharides, right? Remember, this is glucose. This is a monomer. And this is a monomer. 2 monomers together, this is going to be a disaccharide. It's going to have 2 rings. I can spell. And you'll notice something else. There's water. So anytime you're putting monomers together, you're going to produce water as a product. So you guys haven't had chemistry yet, but you did take IPS last year. So let's remember some IPS terms, right? We have on the left side of a chemical reaction, we have reactants, right? And then after the arrow on the other side, we have products. So whenever you're building a polysaccharide, or anytime you're building a polymer, that type of reaction is called a dehydration synthesis or a condensation reaction. And it's called that because you always get water as a product. So in dehydration synthesis, and you can remember it this way, right? When you dehydrate something, when you're dehydrated, you've lost a lot of water, right? So in dehydration synthesis, you have physically pulled a water molecule out and it's become your product. You can also think of it, it's also called condensation reaction because think about when you put something cold out and water condenses on the outside of the glass. But really, dehydration is probably a better word because you're pulling water out. Dehydration synthesis. You have your reactants, and out of those reactants, you pull out a water molecule. And I'll show you exactly how that works in a minute. So this type of reaction This is what builds all polymers. So it doesn't matter whether you're talking about carbs, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. The reaction name is the same. It's a type of reaction. So amino acids bond to form proteins using dehydration synthesis. Nucleotides bond to form nucleic acids using dehydration synthesis, right? And you're always going to get a water molecule. Same thing with fatty acids and glycerol to make lipids, or whether the thing that we're actually talking about, putting together monosaccharides to form polysaccharides. So here's one monomer. This is one glucose molecule right here. See how I have that little OH there? Here's a ribose molecule. I can tell because it's got 5 sides, right? So here's glucose. Here's ribose, right? Glucose and ribose. Here we have an OH, and here we have an H. When we want to put these together to form a disaccharide, that water molecule falls out, and these two monomers are joined at that oxygen. So that is the actual process that happens when you put two monomers together. You've got a hydroxyl, OH. Here, let's do this. These are words you should probably know. OH is a hydroxyl, right? Whenever you see OH, it's called a hydroxyl. H is just hydrogen, right? Or you can say a hydrogen ion. This whole thing is a hydroxyl, but the whole thing's not going to go away, just the H's, right? So whenever you're bonding two monomers, right? Two monomers together, you're going to have the hydroxyl from one that's going to bond with a hydrogen from the other. That forms your H2O, and your water drops out. That's a dehydration synthesis. So if you're producing water, that means you're building molecules. So let's talk about polysaccharides, right? Polysaccharides are long chains of monosaccharides. We kind of talked about that already. Starch is excess plant sugar or glucose that's converted and stored, right? So here we have multiple glucose molecules, and you can see they're bonded at that oxygen. So in putting this together, can you guess how many molecules of how many molecules of water fell out? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 molecules of water were produced by the formation of this molecule. And you can tell by every time there's 2 linked together. So anytime they join, a water molecule fell out. That's a dehydration synthesis reaction. So we think of starch in like foods like rice, potatoes, bread, right? Those are polysaccharides. Those are complex carbohydrates. Simple carbohydrates are more like fruit, right? But complex carbohydrates are like really starchy foods. Potatoes, carrots, lots of energy storage by plants. Yep, see, potatoes. And then we talked about glycogen. Glycogen is a starch molecule that's formed, well, we don't call it starch, we call it a carbohydrate. It's formed in animals, so we take the glucose from the food that we eat and we build this huge molecule. Think about all the energy that's contained. Because remember, energy is contained in each one of these bonds right here. So this is where the energy is contained. Oh, I shouldn't circle the O's. Let me rephrase that. The energy is contained right here in these chemical bonds, right? Because all chemical bonds is energy storage. All chemical, and like this will save you in chemistry and in biology, all chemical bonds is stored energy. All chemical bonds is stored energy. Okay? That's why carbohydrates are so good at storing energy, because you put a whole bunch of monomers together and you store a whole bunch of energy. And then you break them and get that energy back out. You can think of them as like batteries. Okay, so where was I? Here we go, glycogen, right? So look at all these rings that are bonded together. Think about how much energy is stored in here. And if you counted all these up, 30,000 glucose monomers make up one molecule of glycogen. That's a ton. That's very, very dense, very high energy molecule. So we store glycogen in our liver. We talked about cellulose, right? That's a polysaccharide, and it's used to make cell walls. Remember, the cell membrane's on the inside and the cell wall's on the outside. Celery, right? It's full of cellulose. That's why we call it celery. So if we're eating polysaccharides, we're eating these big complex molecules, right? We can't use them in that complex form. We need to break them down to get to that energy that's stored in those bonds. So we have to digest them. The process of breaking complex molecules down is called hydrolysis. Hydrolysis. Hydro means water. Lysis means to break. Hydrolysis. We're breaking molecules with water. So the addition of a water molecule breaks polymers into smaller monomers. And one more time, this is how all polymers are digested. So if you eat protein and you need to break it down, you use hydrolysis to produce amino acids. If you ate a bunch of food with DNA in it, which it's a living thing, it kind of has to have it in there, right? So pretty much everything you have in it, everything you eat has DNA in it. You're going to use water to break it down into nucleotides. If you ate eggs and bacon for breakfast, right? You got lots of lipids in there. You're going to use water to help break down those lipids into fatty acids and glycerol. And the same thing with polysaccharides, right? You're going to use water to break those polysaccharides into monosaccharides. This is why you get thirsty when you eat, right? You eat a whole bunch of food and then your body starts working to try and break all those big molecules down and you're thirsty. You need water to help you do that. So this is that same reaction we saw before, but it's flipped. Now we have our reactants and we have our products. We're going from a bigger molecule to two smaller monomers. So we're going from a polymer to a monomer. Well, two monomers. Right? We're going to add that water molecule back in, and it's going to split those molecules apart. I did that too fast. So we're going to add the water molecule back in, right? And it's going to cause those bonds to break back into our two monomers. So it's the exact same reaction as before, but backwards. So let's review those two types of reactions. Dehydration synthesis. This is when you're going from monomer to polymer. Right? So here are your two monomers. Here is your disaccharide, your bigger, more complex molecule. And remember, we produced water as a product. So we have reactants on this side. Your reactants are your monomers. And your products is your polymer plus water. Now, hydrolysis is the exact same thing, but backwards. We're going from polymer to monomer. Right? Hydro means water. Lysis means to break. We're going to break down that bigger molecule with water. Here's our bigger molecule. We're going to add water. And we're going to break it back into our polymers, right? So it disappeared. So polymer to monomer. Your reactants are your polymer plus water. And you're going to produce your products are 2 monomers or monosaccharides, right? So for both, we have monosaccharides. It's another word. Monosaccharides, 2 monosaccharides. Right? And this is a disaccharide. Over here, we have a disaccharide. Over here, we have 2 monosaccharides. I know it sounds like I'm being repetitive, but you used a lot of new words today, and a lot of them mean the same thing, and you have to be able to be fluent and understand what someone is talking about, whether they use the word monomer or monosaccharide, right? Monomer applies to all building blocks. Monosaccharide is specific to carbohydrates, right? So the monomer of carbohydrates is monosaccharide. The polymer of carbohydrates is a disaccharide or a polysaccharide. Okay. So, essential question number 4. How are the polysaccharides different in plants and animals? Well, we've kind of already talked about this like 3 different times. So on your paper, go ahead and make this table. Right? It's the same table as right here. And you're smart enough to fill this out yourself. Okay? So you need to tell me whether it was found in plants or animals, right? And what's its purpose and function. Alrighty? Remember, these are polysaccharides. And then when you're done with that, you can answer the questions. Also, there is a question at the end that asks you to give any feedback. That question is worth 0 points, but that's your chance to ask me any questions you have about the content or let me know what you think about the videos so that I can make them better, okay? And again, if you have any questions about the content, go ahead and put them in there because then when I grade it, I see it and I can answer your question. Okay? Remember, you can always send me an email. You can always send me a remind. I miss you guys. I wish I was there, and I'll talk to you soon.